Sometimes, truth is stranger than fiction. Today, I'm going to share with you two stories that prove just that. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, if you're into weird, mysterious, and slightly dark stories, you've come to the right place. That's what we do, and we post new content every week. If that sounds like you, give this video a like. And if your phone is lying around, pick it up and spam the password until it locks itself for a week. Also, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Now, let's get started. Nestor Flores had never believed in horror stories. To him, they were simply the product of his imagination, stories to scare children or make money from horror movie fans. But on that fateful night, he realized that there were things that could not be explained by logic or science. At 8 p.m. on December 12, Nestor was driving down a deserted highway outside Dallas, Texas. The dim streetlights only illuminated small patches of road. The surrounding space was pitch black, with only the sound of the car engine echoing in the quiet sky. He had just left a bar after a few drinks with friends. Although he was still relatively sober, he still felt a little nervous. If he was stopped by the police, things would get complicated. But as long as he drove carefully, he would get home safely. Nestor sighed, reaching for a Diet Coke from the cup holder. But the moment he looked up at the road ahead, a chill ran down his spine. A figure suddenly appeared in front of the car. Bam! A terrible collision rang out. The windshield shattered, small pieces of glass flying all over the cabin. The car shook violently. He felt like he had just hit something, or someone. Trying to stay calm, Nestor slowly pulled the car to the side of the road. His breathing was rapid. When he turned his head to look behind him, the road was empty. There was nothing. No trace of a body or a stabbed animal. He swallowed. It couldn't be. With such a strong impact, there should have been a body, or at least a trail of blood, but there was nothing. Only pitch-black darkness swallowed the road behind him. A feeling of unease filled his chest. The air around him became stifling, heavy as if something invisible was watching him from the darkness. Nestor let out a shaky breath, muttering, "I must be imagining it." He started the car, determined to continue driving home. But after driving another 38 miles, a strange noise came from the engine. Clang, clang. Then a thick plume of white smoke billowed from the hood. The car began to vibrate violently. Nestor quickly pulled into a parking lot near a fast food restaurant on the side of the road. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. But as he looked around, an unusual feeling crept into his mind. There were no other cars in the parking lot. The restaurant was still open, but there was no one inside. He took out his phone to call for help, but the screen was black. The battery was dead. Fuck! He cursed, then opened the car door and stepped out. As soon as his feet touched the cold ground, a cold blast of air swept over him. A foul stench filled the air, the pungent scent of blood and rotting flesh. His heart pounded. He slowly scanned the parking lot. And then he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, just below the flickering streetlights. The figure didn't move, but he could clearly feel it staring at him. Its body was thin, twisted in a grotesque way. Its eyes, two deep black holes, glow like two burning coals. A feeling of dread washed over Nestor, making his entire body freeze. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes, silently praying. When he opened them again, the figure was gone. He gasped, his heart pounding. "I'm panicking. It can't be real," he told himself. But then, in the rearview mirror, he saw it. In the back seat, a shadowy, shapeless figure sat there. Nestor felt his blood freeze. He tried to breathe, but the air seemed to be sucked out. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. Those red eyes slowly looked at him through the mirror, as if enjoying his fear. And then it whispered, "You saw me. Now I'm going to follow you." Nestor's whole body shook. He jumped up, jumped out of the car, and ran towards the restaurant. But when he got close, he stopped. The restaurant wasn't there anymore. There was only a dilapidated building with broken windows and overgrown weeds. Looking through the frosted glass, it was dark inside, with only the rotten tables and chairs and strange stains on the floor. A cold wind blew by. "You saw me. Now I'll follow you." This time, the voice didn't come from inside the car. It was right next to him. A cold hand was placed on his shoulder. Nestor didn't have time to scream. The darkness swallowed him. The ghost in the passenger seat. Nestor's car continued to speed along the deserted highway, the streetlights winding like faint streaks of light on the wet pavement. The rain had just stopped, leaving the air cold and heavy. Nestor's mind seemed to be covered by a thick fog. The dizziness from the alcohol continued to linger, his eyes blurred, as if everything around him was blending into a blurry mass. He just wanted to go home, escape everything, and fall into a deep sleep. But perhaps this sleep would not be what he expected. Bang! A loud crash, as if something had hit the car. The car lurched, the wheels screeching on the wet pavement. Nestor was startled, feeling like his heart was jumping out of his chest. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his muscles tensing, his eyes wide open, looking forward. "What the hell?" he thought to himself. But as his eyes followed, there was only vast darkness and dim streetlights. He stopped, parked the car by the side of the road, and sat there for a while, until his breathing gradually calmed down. There were no deer, no obstacles, just the quiet and cold night. He sighed, trying to calm himself. "I must be just tired. I must have seen wrongly." But then the feeling returned. A strange feeling, as if someone was watching him from the passenger seat. He glanced to his right. At first, there was only darkness. Then, gradually, under the weak light of the streetlights, the image of a man gradually appeared. The man sat silently in the passenger seat, his hair disheveled, his face no longer intact, his eyes lifeless, staring out the window. His shirt was covered in blood. One leg was gone. Only torn flesh remained. Blood splattered everywhere. Nestor screamed, his hands shaking, the car lurching and then slamming into the curb. His heart stopped. He slammed on the brakes, trying to keep the car steady. When he turned to look back at the passenger seat, there was no one there. The seat was empty, the blood-stained shirt a mere memory. It was just an illusion. "I had too much to drink," Nestor told himself, but when he looked down at his hands, a shiver ran down his spine. His hands, the hands that had been gripping the steering wheel, were covered in blood. Blood was everywhere, dripping onto the floor. He couldn't believe his eyes. He threw himself out of the car, staggering, his stomach churning, and then he gagged, a wave of nausea rising. But as his memories began to return, the pieces of the puzzle began to come into focus. That impact, that noise, wasn't the deer. There was only one man. That man. The man he'd killed. While he was driving, he didn't realize that he had hit a man walking on the road. That's why he drove away, didn't report it, didn't stop. He had killed a man without knowing it. The knock on the window startled him, his heart pounding harder. He turned around and saw a policeman standing outside, the flashlight shining on his face, making everything even more blurry. Before Nestor could say anything, the policeman ordered, "Get out of the car." Immediately, he obeyed shakily, his legs almost giving out. When the policeman shone the flashlight on the passenger seat, he saw the policeman suddenly step back, his eyes widening. The policeman's hand hurriedly grabbed the radio, his voice trembling. "Send out an emergency request. There's a dead body in the car." Nestor turned his head. Yes, the body was still sitting there, but this time it was smiling. The smile was lifeless, just a creepy smile of death. The body of Terry Ivory, the man he had run over, sat there, eyes wide open, expressionless, just still. Now Nestor could no longer hide. He had killed, and now the body sat there, smiling, a dark reminder that there was no escaping the truth. The roar of the police car rang out, and Nestor was arrested, accused of Terry Ivory's death. But in his heart, it was not over. The eyes of the body still followed him, always haunting, inescapable. Horror story: The Flame of Death. On December 15, 1997, a cold afternoon in Philadelphia, Luc Quaz, a new mother, was sitting on the small couch in her apartment. She held her 10-day-old daughter in her arms, looking at her beautiful and peaceful. The baby, Delamar Vera, was the only light in her life, a new hope after months of waiting. Luc's family had come to meet her, showering praise and affection on the child. The room was filled with laughter, but when Delamar began to become upset, Luc gently stood up and carried her upstairs to the nursery. She placed the baby in the crib, rocking her until she fell asleep in a sweet dream. Before leaving, Luc carefully turned on the heater so that her daughter's room would be warm while she slept soundly. Then she closed the door and went back downstairs to continue talking with her family. When everyone left, Luc felt exhausted but wanted a nap. She returned to the sofa, closing her eyes for a moment of peace. But just as she was about to fall asleep, a loud sound rang out from upstairs, a loud crash, as if something had fallen to the ground. Luc jumped, opened her eyes wide, and immediately rushed up the stairs. An indescribable fear gripped her. As she approached the hallway, a thick black smoke was pouring out of Delamar's room. Luc's eyes were blurry, her heart pounding in her chest. Without thinking, she rushed into her daughter's room, where a sea of fire was engulfing her. The flames raged fiercely, burning everything in sight. The room was now unrecognizable. Every object, everything was burned. But there was one thing Luc couldn't understand, and that was where her daughter was. She looked around frantically, her eyes panicked, but she couldn't find Delamar. The fire was blazing, the smoke was thick, her body was starting to burn from the terrible heat. Despite the searing pain, Luc didn't give up. She called out her daughter's name, screaming in desperation. "Delamar! Where are you?" Her voice caught in her throat, but only the sound of fire answered her. Luc rushed into the sea of fire. Her heart felt like it was about to break apart as she looked at the burning crib. She couldn't see her daughter. She felt the life drain from her. Her body began to sag, without strength. The smoke was suffocating. The pain from the burns made everything blurry. She could barely breathe. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps rang out. The firefighters finally arrived, rushing in, dragging Luc out of the house. But they couldn't save Delamar. In her panic, Luc screamed, "Where's my baby? Where's my baby?" But there was no answer. The firefighters carried her out, and moments later they put out the fire. In her daze, Luc didn't know if she was alive or dead. When the house fell silent, the firefighters found Luc, but they couldn't save the baby. When she brought Luc out, she could see nothing but burns on her body. The pain and loss were so great that she could feel nothing but emptiness. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the burns, but something strange. inexplicable. In the fire, when the flames had died down, Luke saw a shadowy figure in the smoke, a dark figure, standing watching her from the ruins. A sinister smile appeared, as if the fire was not an accident but a long, planned one. But when Luke looked closely, the figure was not her daughter. Guilt, fear, and emptiness overwhelmed her. And then, like an unending nightmare, Luke realized that she would never escape those memories, the terrifying images of the fire and the indelible laughter in the dark. Horror story. Endless haunting. Luke Quaz's life had completely collapsed since the day the terrible fire happened. When the announcement that Delamar, her little daughter, had died in that fire, a part of her had died as well. The extreme pain made her like a ghost wandering this world. Life no longer had meaning. She lived in emptiness, not interacting with anyone. No family, no friends. She had just divorced, and life became darker than ever. Every day, Luke locked herself in a small room where there was only her and her nightmares. The grief ate away at her every day, and the guilt weighed heavily on her. She couldn't forgive herself, especially when investigators suggested that the fire might have been caused by the space heater she'd left on before leaving the room. They couldn't confirm it, but Luke couldn't stop obsessing over the possibility that the space heater had killed her daughter. This obsession became an integral part of her life, like a dark shadow clinging to her every thought. For years, Luke couldn't escape the image of the fire and the irreparable loss. She lived in the shadow of her past, afraid to go out, not meeting anyone. The world around her gradually faded away. However, on January 24, 2004, 6 years after the fire, Luke received an invitation to a family party. It had been a long time since she had attended any social event. Although she had always lived in seclusion, today she decided to step out. But when she arrived at the party, the warm and noisy atmosphere seemed to be unable to touch her mind. She just stood quietly in a corner, away from everyone, just observing from afar. But then, something strange began to attract her attention. A sudden cold feeling invaded her, as if someone was watching her. Luke turned around, and her heart stopped when she saw something she couldn't believe. She saw a blurry figure, a dark shadow standing in the corner of the room, looking straight at her, eyes lifeless and cold. The figure's long hair fluttered lightly, as if the wind was blowing through it, but it didn't shake it at all. It wasn't a person, but rather like a ghost, something inhuman. Luke stood still, unable to move, just staring at that shadow. All the sounds around her seemed to stop. The air became heavy. Her eyes widened in fear, unable to move away from that terrifying image. She wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. Her body stiffened, unable to do anything but stand there, motionless. After 3 days of fear and obsession, Luke couldn't bear it anymore. She decided to go see a state legislator. A strange feeling urged her to do this. When she entered the office, she felt an eerie silence in the space. She greeted the legislator coldly and sat down. Her hands trembled as she took out her wallet, her eyes still unable to move away from that dark shadow in her memory. She pulled out a small plastic bag containing something strange and placed it on the table, gently sliding it towards the man opposite. The legislator picked up the bag, his eyes unreadable. But when he opened it, his face immediately changed, his complexion turning pale. In the pocket was an old napkin, but no ordinary napkin. It had black stains and strange markings, as if it had been through something inexplicable. A feeling of coldness and fear permeated the air. "Luke," the legislator began, his voice trembling. You found it?" Luke did not reply. She just looked at the napkin, her eyes filled with fear and despair. And then the lights in the room flickered out, and a small sound, like someone's breathing, echoed in the silence. Luke felt the presence of something invisible, something she could not see, but felt clearly. A cold wind suddenly blew, making her hair flutter. In the darkness, the figure appeared again, this time clearer, closer, as if it was coming towards her. "My daughter? Delamar!" Luke whispered, unable to believe what she was experiencing. She felt like she was about to be completely lost in a spiral from which she could not escape. In that terrifying silence, darkness enveloped everything, and Luke could no longer tell what was real and what was imaginary. The scene became more and more blurry, as if the space around her had been distorted. Each passing minute seemed to drag on forever, making Luce feel like she was sinking into a bottomless pit. The light from the table lamp swayed, drawing ghostly shadows on the wall, undulating shapes that seemed to be chasing each other. Those shadows seemed to be following her, making her unable to stop feeling something dark and threatening from within herself. Her heart clenched, not just with fear, but with another feeling, a feeling she couldn't name. It was the urge to know the truth, but also the fear of facing what had been hidden in the past. The hairs in the plastic bag were not just fragments of a forgotten story, but the door to a truth she didn't want. She remembered that fateful day when the fire burned down her house, and her daughter disappeared like a ghost in the smoke. The feeling was disorienting, as if she were living in a bad dream where everything was vague, elusive. The investigation was intense, but the results were still a mess. She had searched for her daughter in every corner, but she had never found her. And now, after all that pain, this plastic bag brought her back to the doubts she couldn't shake. The hairs in the legislator's hand were now like a new fire, burning everything in her mind. He picked up the bag, his eyes unable to leave the hairs, as if they were telling him something that no one else could understand. Luce's heart clenched. She knew what he was thinking. Was he wondering? Could this be true? Could what she said be trusted? Could these hairs really be her daughter's? Silence filled the room, a suffocating space filled with tension. Luce couldn't bear it anymore. She walked towards the legislator, but each step became heavier. She felt like her feet were sinking into the ground, unable to move, as if something was holding her back. She opened her mouth, but couldn't say a word. All she could do was stare at that plastic bag, where life and death, memory and reality, all blended together. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the silence. Footsteps, but not the legislator's. She turned around, her heart pounding. A chill ran down her spine. She looked around, but the room was deathly silent. The feeling only added to her confusion. There seemed to be something in the air, an invisible ghost. Only the wind whistling through the window, carrying the chill like a warning. She closed her eyes, feeling so suffocated that she couldn't breathe. Everything seemed to spin around her. The strands of hair in the plastic bag continued to remind her of the past she never wanted to remember, but now couldn't escape. Had her daughter really died in that fire? Or was she still alive, and it had all been a cruel game? "Okay," the legislator said, his voice still hoarse with tension. "I'll look into it." But the words were like a knife stabbing into Luce's heart. The words brought no comfort, only made her feel more alone than ever. She had waited so long to hear them, but now that they had come, they meant nothing. All she wanted was an answer, an explanation for the years of pain she had endured. "She can't be my daughter," Luce whispered, almost like a plea. "There's no way. She couldn't have survived that fire." But in the legislator's eyes, she saw something she couldn't quite place. Was he looking at things from a different angle? Was he finding a truth she couldn't face? The wind outside the window continued to whistle, like a faint warning. She glanced at the plastic bag, and for the first time in years, she felt a new fear. Fear that the truth, no matter how painful, would change everything she believed. And then, another small sound, this one clearer, like footsteps in the hallway. The tension inside her grew, and she knew the thing she had always feared was finally near. She raised her head, looking straight into the legislator's eyes. It was time to face the truth, no matter how terrible it was. But was she strong enough to bear it?